I went and met a soccer player, a football player this week, Ronaldo, Cristiano.
Very glad you brought that out, because as a Manchester United fan, that was the
great.
thing I wanted to ask him.
It was great. But we talked a bit about his life, and he really, in some sense, can't go out because he's so famous. And so nothing in his life he doesn't have the advantages of someone who's ordinary, let's say. Think, well, there's no advantages to being ordinary. It's like, yeah, there is. You can walk down to your local pharmacy. That's a big advantage. And Ronaldo doesn't have that. And you say, well, he's got his fortune, and he does, and he deserves it as far as I'm concerned. But he lives a circumscribed life. And his life is nowhere near as circumscribed as the Queen's life was. I mean, she was on display. She had to be on her best behavior every single place she went from the time she was in her early 20s for 70 years. Always on her best behavior. And you think you could have managed that? In your situation, where hardly anyone's looking at you at all, you're on your best behavior all the time, are you? I don't think so. You think you could have done what she did? And then you accuse her of like this unearned privilege. It's like her life was one. Look, I'm sure she had a wonderful adventure, and more power to her for that. But her life was one of service, clearly. We don't even know who she was. And that's as it should be. Now we know, we can infer she was a conscientious person. She was emotionally stable. She had a nice balance of agreeable and disagreeable, because she was not a pushover, but she was a caring person. She was reserved. I would say she was somewhat introverted. She wasn't spectacularly creative. And that might be just as well in a monarch, because a monarch is a traditional force. Charles is more creative, I think, than Elizabeth. And that's possibly to his detriment. Now, we'll see, because that could be integrated. But it's complicated when you're a traditional icon to be creative, because those aren't the same thing. And so you can infer Elizabeth's personality, but we really don't know who she was. And that's because she kept what was private to herself. And
don't complain, don't explain. Very much her mantra. And we were talking about this before we started recording. But in an age where privilege is the cardinal sin, and yet monarchy, I think, has an 80 to 85% approval rating in this country, and you were saying this is perhaps because of the way she sacrificed her life serve the people.
Well, exactly. I think that Elizabeth atoned for her privilege, right? And I think we all have to do that. And I think part of the criticism of privilege that's emerging out of the left, to give the devil his due, once again, is that privilege demands a commensurate responsibility. But that needs to be universalized, because as modern people, we're more privileged than any people who have ever lived by a large margin. I think the average family deemed as below the poverty line in the United States has 2 vehicles. And almost all of them have air conditioning. And a non-substantial minority, a non-trivial minority, have swimming pools. And so poverty in the United States, and I'm not saying there aren't poor people in the United States, and I'm not saying there aren't disenfranchised people, but that often it's a lot more complicated often than mere lack of money. We have a lot of privilege in the modern world, especially in the West. And we need to atone for that. And atone means at one. That's the word, at one. That has to be aimed at something sufficiently high so that the privilege is justified. And what that means in some sense is that as you have more, as you've been granted more, because that's your privilege, what you've been granted, you are morally obligated to take on more responsibility. And you might say, well, why should I? And the answer to that is, well, first of all, if you don't, your conscience will torture you. Second, if you don't and your conscience torments you and the mob comes for you, you will convict yourself, right, and be unable to mount a defense. Fourth, you'll find that the privilege, if it's not accompanied by a commensurate responsibility, will be hollow and counterproductive. And so you'll be nihilistic and desperate in a sea of plenty. And none of that's good. And so that demand on the left for privilege to be held accountable, there's an element of that that's properly manifest, but a huge amount of it is contaminated with like a presumptuous and narcissistic envy and an insistence that anyone who has any more than anyone else, which generally means any more than me, has only accrued it through theft. It's like, well, if the person who has more than you only accrued it through theft, and you have more than anyone, like anyone you could speak of, any particular person, so there's some person out there who you have more than. Well, did you not steal it too? So why can that accusation not be levied against you? Well, I don't mean people like me. It's like, yeah, that's convenient for you. I went to this Hollywood lecture once. It was in a very rich Hollywood neighborhood. We were sitting on this lawn that sloped down over the Hollywood Hills, looking at the Star City in the background. It was really beautiful. And the woman who was lecturing to this crowd of about 200 wealthy people, by any standard, was talking about the 1%. And it was so comical. And at the end, I stood up and said, I don't know if you noticed, but you're the 1%, clearly. And if you don't know it, it's like, well, look around. Well, they didn't think so because they thought they were like at the 95th percentile, and then there's the 5%. Well, and it's not trivial, right? Because maybe you're a millionaire, but you're not a billionaire. And even if you're a billionaire, you're not Elon Musk. Like there are tiers of privilege above you. And so it's really easy for you to think, well, you're the place where victimization starts. Your tier is where victimization starts. Me and everyone lower than me, we're the victims. And everyone above is the thieves. It's like, well, you know, go 2 or 3 layers down and you're indistinguishable from the billionaires to someone who, you know, for whom the ability to buy a glass of Coca-Cola is a sign of almost unimaginable social status. And that's probably the case for maybe 2 billion people in the world. So we have no idea how much in the West we're all in the 1%, and certainly by historical standards. And so we have plenty to atone for. And we're being called upon to do it, right? Shoulder the burden of historical atrocity. Like, well.
Back to Cristiano Ronaldo, if I may, because I'm a huge Man United fan. And how did that come about? What was it like meeting him? What's he thinking? What's in his mind? Is he a fan of yours? Has he read Maps of Meaning?
Well, he had some. His family went through some difficult times a few months ago, and someone forwarded him one of my lectures, and he started watching them, and then he started to read 12 Rules for Life, and he said it was very helpful, and so he reached out to me. Had heard through the grapevine, I suppose, that I would be in Manchester, and so he reached out to me, and I thought, well, that sounds like fun. And so I went out to his house, and we talked for about 2 hours about, mostly, as it turned out, we talked about the details of his current career and spent most of the time strategizing. So that was very fun. And, you know, he's quite a remarkable person, as far as I could tell. Very youthful looking, which is relevant because he's kept himself in very good shape, which he has to because he's 37 and still playing football at a very high level. So, you know, he's had to attend to himself physically. He's very disciplined. I found him very open and gracious. He clearly loves his wife. He's a very, very astute businessman. He's super smart. As far as I could tell, not surprising at all. Apart from, you know, his God-given natural talent, it's not surprising at all that he's who he is. And he was one of those people you meet, you think, yeah, kind of figures. You're who you are, like all the way to the core. And so we had a very productive time together, and the time flew. he said, he wasn't sure what we were going to talk about, and I wasn't sure. I mean, I'm a Canadian, and so.
Do you know what of your lectures that he appealed to him? Was it the biblical series? Was it something specific?
I don't know specifically. No, I didn't ask him about the specifics. I think if I had to guess, it would be the lectures pertaining to the sustaining meaning of responsibility and proper action in the face of tragedy. I suspect that would be the theme that was productive, but I don't know specifically.